morning is Bryan Asson. And he has a committee member, Julie and Kumon, myself, etc. We're going to be going to a piece of land in Baltimore, close to I-95. And Bryan, take a step, please.
Before I get started, I'd like to thank my committee, Carl Dupuy, who has been very patient with me these last couple of months, and Julie Gabrielli, who's been very kind and worrisome over me and completing this project. So I appreciate it. So starting, my thesis is Architecture and Water, an amphibious solution to urban flooding. So designs of a purely arbitrary nature cannot be expected to last long. This is a quote by Kenzo Tange, a prominent figure within the metabolist movement, and a key principle of how I approached my own design. Architectural permanence is very important, not only to the architect, but to the people who live in the buildings that we design. One of the key problems in that our architectural permanence faces is water. Water, when it's introduced to a building, can lead to mold, sickness, and structural instability. But it's also one that we are starting to find happening more often due to climate change. We often build buildings so that we can deal with this water and architecture duality. So we build roofs to protect ourselves from water. We build downspouts to move water away from a building. But these problems are becoming more and more apparent due to climate change. Climate change is very real. It's happening, even though some people deny it. And it's causing too much water in some areas and too little water in others. So climate change is causing sea level rise and flooding, but it's also causing things like the water crisis in Africa and other places, like specifically Cape Town, where they've limited the water supply on a daily, for the resident on a daily basis. But it's also happening within our own context, the United States. So Miami, Florida is dealing very much with these issues. In Miami, they have they're built on porous limestone, and the water is starting to rise up underneath and starting to flood it. And it's affecting up to $3.5 trillion in assets, and so far they've allotted $400 million to South Beach alone to update their plans. They've raised the elevation of they've started to raise elevations, invest in their wetlands and other pumping infrastructure. But that's not the only problem. In places like Houston, Texas, and Ellicott City, they're seeing flooding due to poor planning design, which is the cause of lack of permeability. And these effects are compounded by pollution, which mixes with the water and affects the entire water supply. So we get these problems because we build close to water, but why do we build close? We build close because access equals value. When we build close to water, we have done so traditionally because of defense, mercantilism, activity, and swimming and all of these things. But the problem is that with sea level rise, we're getting more flooding, more storm surges and more pollution. Traditionally, what we've done is we've either done one of two things: rebuild or set back. We've run away from our problems, basically. So this thesis encourages the idea that perhaps one solution to these problems is creating efforts that foster resiliency and staying on these landscapes and embracing the positive aspects of water. Instead of this cycle of rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, we want to break that cycle because these are solutions that aren't expected to last long. So looking at a group of people who did attempt to solve some of these problems in some aspects or another, the metabolists who came out of 1950s CM conference, they were led by Kenzo Tangi, who I spoke about earlier, and they created these megastructures. This is the Tokyo Bay plan. They created megastructures that extended over the Tokyo Bay, and these plug-in modules that went onto them, and civic buildings that ran through the center. In their probably most prominent design was the Nagaten Capsule Tower by Kikutuni. It saw the megastructure as the core space with stairs and elevator that went through the center and plug-in residential modules. And the Marine City was an extension of the Tokyo Bay plan, in which we also saw vertical towers of modularity with inner rings and outer rings that dealt with water differently, some for activity and some for fishing. Another group that's dealing with water in interesting ways are the Northern Europeans. So the BO01 project in Malmo dealt with it interestingly by bringing water into the site and using it to foster sustainability. Hammarby in Sweden uses a cool waste management system of chutes to transfer waste, and Ijsberg in the Netherlands dealt with this at a neighborhood scale. So this fostered my interest in Dundalk. So Dundalk is a place in Baltimore County. You can see it here. Baltimore would be up further. And there's a marine terminal in Sparrows Point. So if you're looking at this is Baltimore. It's adjacent to the Dundalk Marine Terminal, which does 40 containers per hour and is one of the largest in Maryland. And Sparrows Point, which is set to bring in $2.9 million in economic growth to the area through things like Amazon has a location there, and cars, and it's set to bring in over 17,000 jobs to the area. But it's also dealing with a lot of flooding. So presently, it's fine. There's a neighborhood to the north of it, but over time, by 2100, it's set to take on about 5 feet of incoming sea level rise, and this will start to flood adjacent neighborhoods and the site itself. By 2100, we're set to have at least one storm that will leave 10 feet of sea level rise to the area, taking over the entire site and leaving merely a spine. So this once again is the site, in context. When thinking about the site, I developed key ideas and addressing how to design on the site and what I thought this thesis should be about. So the goals of this thesis were to provide a safe space for people to live and thrive in flood conditions, 2, creating infrastructure and water-sensitive urban design, and 3, show the community how they intersect with the ecological system. To do so, I created a rule set, which is my manifesto. 1, that buildings must adapt to sea level rise and flooding. 2, that landscape and architecture are one and the same. 3, that buildings are modular and adaptable. And 4, that the building technology should facilitate these changes. So with that being said, I'll take you through the boards and run you through some of how this design came to fruition. So this is the site and its flooding context. It has one street, Breckenridge Drive, that connects it, and R95, which runs through the Key Bridge. And so otherwise, it's generally isolated from other contexts. When thinking about this design, I separated the goals into a kit of parts, much like the Metabolist did, to create a system that works. So I developed a system of buildings, architectural and landscape, that work in tandem with one another. Thank you. So, too late? This is Carl Dupuy. I developed 4 types of residential, which I'll talk about in a few. The Amphibious House, the bar building, a courtyard building, an alternate bar building, and the tower. Storage facilities, pumps, structured parking, and commercial facilities. So these all operate under the guise of an entire plan, which is 45 acres. So there's Riverside Lake here and a marsh here with a canal that runs through. And so the general areas are a commercial district coming in off of Breckenridge Drive. You enter through a gateway. So there's 2 shopping areas here. You can see them in red up there. That flank, they are the gateway and entry to the main site. Flanking that would be the large tower, which is the landmark of the site, and then high density towards the marsh area, and low density amphibious housing towards the Riverside Lake. So when thinking about the site and how these when thinking about the building, when thinking about the kit of parts, I thought about how they play into a system, much like the Metabolist. I developed a water system, which is based off of the typical evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and then collection. But then that feeds into the entire loop, which becomes the man-made cycle of collection and then cleaning into potable water, and then how individual systems within the building context work. So that would be how energy systems feed into other water systems, like, for example, an aquaponics center, which would have worms feed fish, have those fish be able to be sold, or how those fish end up providing for vegetables, and they can be sold as well. So that happens within these what I call baths, which are akin to the harbor baths, and they are almost a fishbowl within a fishbowl of sustainable features that are included because of the isolation of the site. So going to the building systems, I thought of how these buildings were in tandem with one another to collect water and to transport water from one area to another. The tower having a growing space with a pink lab that feeds into the gateway, and then the baths feeding into an aquaponics center, which also feed into the gateway. Pump building facilities transfer water from the riverside lake into the marsh during heavy storms. For utility systems, there's greenways that run south to north on the site, and it's treated very much like a garden city in the essence that private throughways go through the center, whereas public service ways happen on the exterior of two buildings. So that would happen here. So this would be a public service way, whereas this would be private circulation. Breckenridge Drive stays on the primary spine of the site and won't flood, whereas the others will. And this allows for flow from the Riverside Lake to the marsh area. The flow of water is very important to the site because it's about keeping the water moving rather than stagnant, because that's when you get problems with pollution and brackish water. So this led to allowing the creation of a boardwalk which runs through the site and provides activity and amenities along the lakeside. Now we'll talk about the four scales of residential that I've looked into. So the first being the Amphibious House, which are here and along here. So I looked at a precedent in Thames, and it dealt with using waffle slab construction to allow the building to lift over time. So this is this contains a two-story unit and a one-story unit. So the ground floor repeats and is below, and this is one unit. So this allows it to float. The waffle slab allows it to float during high flood periods, and there's a bridge, which is basically a sculptural transition space that allows for transition in flood periods to safety. Thank you.
Seems appropriate.
It is. Getting dry up here.
Get you through this.
This is a look at the interior space coming in through the living room, and the core is mainly all of the water features, and it's outbounded by a master bed and a study, which gets you outside, and a kitchen. Then looking at the bar building, The bar building, it starts a continuity of using shipping containers as a module, so it uses these either 20-foot deep by 8 feet shipping containers or 40-foot length shipping container. So that would happen, the 40-foot would happen there, whereas the 20-foot would happen here. And that allowed for create this idea of modularity within the space. And it also allowed for a water unit where everything is compiled. So because this deals with water, the sink runs to the toilet, and then the toilet washes out the bathtub, or the dryer or the washer machine can run out to the sink and wash that out. Looking at the Courtyard Building, I thought of back to Greenbelt and kind of this end facility. So you see it, you see these courtyard buildings running on the outside along the marsh. I thought of it as that Greenbelt where I'm redirecting and funneling views and pedestrians into a gathering space and looking outwards towards the marsh, where there's parking below, once again like the bar building. And finally the tower, it has these grow spaces that happen within each tier. You can see it here, 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 and there's one outside that all bring water in from the roof through hydroponic space columns that allow for growing, and that water is collected into tanks, and the growing material that the vegetables or what have you that's grown can be transported to the gateway tower. So looking at entry, when looking at the building, I began to skew the main tower facade outward so that you can look outwards towards the water and everybody gets a view towards the water, much like this, fostering this idea of a garden city and public views. And then on the lower levels, I created a modular system of units that could be used as vending spots that can turn to open or close. When they're turned one way, they allow for people to enter them, and when they're turned the other way, they're closed off to the site. So this is just a quick run through of kind of the project and some of the ideas that I was thinking about this idea of resiliency. And I think as a whole, this project has been about creating an experimental idea in ways that we see water in architecture and how we design. So I'll open it up to questions, concerns.
A couple things. Is this on? No. Here comes help. Test.
Technology.
Test. Oh, it works. Test.
A couple things. I went to school here a long time ago, And when I left here, I felt like I had to go back to school. Not that anything was wrong here. Sorry. Yeah, it didn't quite sound right, did it? But I did so because I thought, at least from my way of seeing the world at that point, I thought the issue for my generation was urbanism, contextualism, understanding how modern architecture had failed us in that way. And I think this is the issue for your generation. I think anybody who enters this profession at this point and doesn't realize it's about things like this is really not understanding what the world is about. So I think it's a really good thing that you took this on. My understanding of your project is you're not really trying to keep the water out necessarily.
Right. No.
You're letting it in.
Right.
And you're saying once it comes in, you're going to deal with it.
Yep.
Well, that is one way of doing it. The main question I have is about the site plan. In terms of the one canal that connects the two bodies of water. Did you ever think about more than one canal? More
than one?
Yeah.
So probably a failure of mine is that there is another one that connects outboard.
Yeah, I'm talking about maybe more. I'm just
That,
wondering
that would limit the. I guess I was trying to test density, how many I could get on the site.
I'm not sure it would limit density. You listed up front the reasons why waterfront sites were important. And virtually all the ones that you listed are no longer valid about defense and that sort of thing. The one that is valid is that people like living on the water.
Yeah.
It's a very attractive site. And there are very few units in this development that are on the water. So was there a scheme that had streets this way and canals that way? So it really was many more units, many more buildings.
You're saying more canals this way?
Correct. You can look at places like Venice, California, where the whole thing is a series of canals that you walk through. Yeah, and they're just really beautiful places. So when I walked up and saw the signs, oh man, living on the water, that's great. Then when I looked at your site plan, it's really not so much about living on the water. Except when it floods. then you're living on the water.
Yeah.
So anyway, and also you talked about the importance of water movement between the two bodies of water. So I'm just wondering if there was a way to really introduce more canals to facilitate.
So I'm sure there is a way. How I approached the design when I was thinking about it was this idea that the community has these throughways in and providing a way to this main boardwalk. So I've ended each point in a node of some sort that interacts with the water. So it was. I'm sure putting canals would give more people direct access, but I was thinking when I was designing more about the connection through a way and giving everyone kind of this connection to the water.
I don't think more canals would stop that.
Right. I don't think so either.
I think more canals would really facilitate that.
Yeah, I agree.
If I take every one of your walkways between the units and made that a canal with walkways on both sides, I think once again it would really, bring more to life that this is a water place.
Yeah, I agree.
I underscore the importance of a project like this, and I just participated in a jury for another local institution that was all about floating buildings, and my point was there's more to dealing with sea level rise, making floating architecture. You have, I think I saw that in a parking garage in Scandinavia that had that vessel that rose, which I thought was fascinating. So you do have some fascinating things going on and taken out of dimension. Do you not see this as a continual digression of the land and the water rising, and then are there any images that you have that kind of shows what it becomes, and maybe it becomes more of the canals or other things take over? Because at some point the water wins, right?
So how I viewed it, at least the scope of the project as I saw it, that was a little bit beyond. There's a lot of looking forward progressively until there is no site at all. But how I saw it was building up to a certain point so that I didn't have to deal, much like Miami's doing, so that I didn't have to deal with the sea level rise to that amount, and then dealing with flooding and the effects of just keeping that water moving consistently throughout the site so that you don't have a buildup of that brackish water, and then keeping areas like structured parking away from the main flood areas, and then composting and grow air and the commercial at that core, because who would want to have a shop at a place that will flood? Yeah.
I want to say I really appreciate the diagrams of your strategies on the top left. I think those are really nice. I like what you're starting to do with the connection of the water to the lake here, and we talked about maybe the idea of more canals. It looks like you're starting to develop those, but I wonder what people can do there. I think there's an opportunity to start to differentiate between those different piers and what might happen on them. I wonder where the boats are, where the kayaks, where the canoes, where like you're talking about what happens when it floods, how are people getting around?
So I was thinking that the marsh after a time will flood, and that's why I was thinking that people start to make that connection. I haven't fully developed that aspect yet.
I think the idea of the floating structure is really fascinating, and I'm sure, like you guys, you said you're on a journey with a lot of projects like that. I think there's a lot of technical issues to a building that moves, but it's a cool idea. What I really like is how you've started to develop that stair, that sculptural stair, and that could be a really interesting kind of marker of history. I imagine the water receding and people taking a Sharpie and saying, this is where it was in 2018,
yeah.
And that sort of, that marker, that remembrance of what it had been. That's cool. Pretty cool.
I just want to start by saying it's an incredibly rigorous set of things that you tried to do. I mean, the scales that you were looking at, the urban scale, the different housing typologies. I mean, it's a lot of thinking, and the water, and there's so many layers to it, and it's incredibly beautifully rendered and shown and demonstrated. So it makes me want to spend hours with you talking about it and looking at it, and I think that's a testament to the quality of the work. I have similar questions. I really wish you would have thought about what happens when the water comes up to +10 and it stays there, because I look at these images with people walking around, and like I feel like it's missing the boat.
Yeah.
It's like I really are there boardwalks? Are there how do
So, just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I thought of more so egress and like this bridge concept of being able to exit from the second floor, and that the main plumbing features and mechanical systems happen on that second floor. But from that scope, I think at least on this project, it would have to involve another phase of creating circulation that can foster that. So it would have to get like a raised pier system that runs through the entire site in this particular scheme.
Yeah, I mean, you started with that. One of my favorite parts of the project was the first set of diagrams where you showed the water coming up, and then what the solution is versus like either setting back or rebuilding exactly the way it was. And one of the things I'm troubled by, and I think this idea of the canals and things helps me start to envision how I'm troubled by the urban kind of how it feels in this urban world that you're creating. And so I think that idea of canals and potentially this relationship between buildings when there is water up to 10 feet, like that might start to help you make a better place. Because right now it is just kind of a series of modular buildings kind of strung along, and it reminds me of some of the modernist developments that really didn't fare very well. So I think there's a lot. I mean, even the fact that you have like towers that are above the ground, and then you have this one amphibious house that floats. I find those things fighting each other. Once there are 10 feet of water, if that lower bedroom was right here, you're looking out a window, you're like literally underwater. So I don't know. Again, I think it's you're studying and trying to do a bunch of different things, and I think that's really powerful and beautiful, and you've taught yourself a lot. But there's some there's some other steps that I'd love to see you think about and take a little further.
I basically would repeat the same sentiment. However, I kind of see you as almost like, I'm imagining this fictitious world where you're sort of like an agent of a really bad developer that's trying to sort of foster this type of solution without looking at the overall issue. Because, you know, you would ask yourself, what's creating flooding? Just sort of at 10,000 feet, what creates the situation that we have to deal with, which is not ideal. Like if you look at New Orleans and Katrina and like all that stuff, flooding is not pretty. Like it's not, I mean, you render these pontoons of housing that rise up and now with blue water, it's going to be brackish water, it's going to be full of diseases, you know, so there is an inherent, almost primal reason why we want to keep it at bay. Suggesting that you're going to sort of have this massive housing on the water that's not helping keeping it at bay. That's actually probably would make it worse in case of a flooding. I don't think you've attacked it the right way.
Okay.
I think idealizing it that, oh, you can raise these houses up and, you know, sort of create this no man's land at street level 99% of the time of the year, but in that one chance where you get that 100-year flood, then, you know, your project comes into fruition and it realizes why it was created. I don't think that's a correct strategy of approaching this project. I think you somehow missed the mark. For example, when I look at your urban design, I'm like, this is why there's flooding, because you have massive runoff. When you sort of plow over land and you create asphalt, and you look at Ellicott City, whenever there's a flooding, it's because the developers keep building and building and paving over land, that when there's a small amount of rain, it floods the waterway and floods the neighborhood, which would be the right solution as opposed to saying, oh, I'm going to just build more and build them taller so that they raise their skirt off and water goes underneath them. And I actually think if you had focused on the pontoon housing as a solution for these sort of urban, smaller granular scale of housing that has to deal with flooding in case it happens, I find that more valid. But when I look at diagrams like that and I see these 6-story buildings and I don't know how tall that building is, I'm like, wait, that's the reason there's flooding, because developers are all about money. You're right underwater, they want to create density underwater and pave over everything and put all these housing there. Well, that's the reason why there will be flooding. It might sound antithetical to the reason of the thesis, but I think if you're approaching a project like this, you sort of have to zoom out and just ask yourself these hard questions. Because when I look at your planning, it's like, wow, that's tough. You know, are there ways that you can create green spaces that could sort of help temper in case, you know, because with those housing that you've built, even though you're showing like green little patches of green, it's going to be pavement everywhere. And so when it does rain, it's going straight into the bay, it's going to flood everything. That's why I sort of said, you might be a secret agent. Maybe the developer goes, oh, I want to build housing, and I'm going to try and foster this solution, but it's not really a solution, it's actually creating a problem. So I would ask you to think about that. I think your architecture is very interesting. Just to sort of deviate from that, I think the choice of articulation and materiality, which doesn't necessarily, I mean, you mentioned shipping containers, I'm like, okay, what does that have to do with it? Is it floating? Does it detach itself from the main pod in case, you know, I would see that, like, in case you design this, like, and water rises, these modules sort of detach themselves and they become floating in the bay or whatever as a solution. But why shipping containers? Why not, you know, why not any other sort of typology? You know, why these terracotta tiles? Why these articulation in the balcony? What does it say about the thesis, about what you're trying to solve? And as opposed to, I mean, you did some diagrams that talks about how you manage the water, how you collect it, and how it sort of gets collected, which I think is starting to peel the covers back on the potential solution of not creating this problem. But I don't want you to sort of take it for granted that flooding is cute.
No,
Flooding is horrific.
Yeah.
The amount of damage that it does economically and at a human level. Because if you've lived in other parts of the world where you see flooding, you stay away.
Yeah.
And you try and create ways to sort of mitigate it, to sort of make sure that it doesn't happen. So I just want you to sort of have that in the back.
Yeah, definitely, it's point.
So the combination of landscape and architecture that you talk can help to deal with that flooding in an aesthetic way. I don't think flooding itself is terrible. I think it could be, as long as it's controlled.
I think there are ways that you could use the landscape here also to help mitigate some of that flooding.
I mean, I understand what
So-
you're saying, that the flooding is
one-
unattractive, but there's plenty of green space here that
So-
could have worked.
Like, well, one way that I attempted to do it was in these kind of these water masses that happen and they protect from storm surges. And then there are other efforts that would happen along the coast. But I had a whole rule set where people don't park close to the water. They park if they're visiting, they get emissions test, all this kind of smaller detail set stuff, but nothing architecturally. I think I could push that properly more.
I think if you had a civil engineering expert
Yeah.
on your team,
Exactly,
I
yeah.
think there's an argument that the green space there could be used to help mitigate some of the floodwater.
I want to underline the fact that this illustrates what theses are about, which is speculation. I think it's terrific. I think there are some legitimate observations to be made about the urban design. You have lots of places to put monuments, and of course all those monuments are going to be vertical water spouts, right? We have learned that sea level rise is a huge issue in Maryland, and it's much bigger than is being addressed politically. I had a student in a spring course last year who's running for public office in Wycomico County, and he is seeking university assistance in dealing with the agricultural implications down there. But you probably know that Dorchester County is the poorest county in the state, and the third rail of politics in Dorchester County is relocation. And yet that's exactly what's going to have to happen in order to solve that problem. Because if you look at the Department of the Environment's maps of the Eastern Shore, Dorchester County basically disappears. So I would have welcomed some more strategic studies about what happens to the water flow through here. And you know that there's only one rating system which calls for net zero water, and that's Living Building Challenge. And so the infrastructure necessary to get you to net zero water as a community is really an interesting idea, and you're well on your way to doing that. So I hope more students in this school will look at this issue because places like Dorchester County really need help, and they're not able to face the problem because they're impoverished. The only asset they have is their property, and that's what's disappearing. So thank you for putting this card up on the table.
I think the comments made about this might be making the problem worse are very important. At the same time, I sort of saw this as not necessarily about Dundalk and Baltimore. I saw this as about if you are in a place where there's no other place to build except sites like this, what do you do? I saw it as that sort of project. I do wonder though, when we talked about the site plan again, what happens to the cars when it floods? What happens to all the trees when it floods? What happens to, like every image that you see of a flooded site, like the one you showed up here, there's always a car turned on its side, or flipped over, flipping down the street. Where do these cars go when this place floods?
Right. So, I had spaces for public parking that are here and here, and I thought.
So if I'm living in that house and I look out the window and I realize the tide's coming, I got to drive up to the public.
Yeah, basically. This is for car storage,
Right, but, and once again, going back to my first comment, this is clearly a serious problem. Architects have to look at this. And I don't want this to sound like I'm not concerned about climate change statement. I do think there are times, I'm not talking about your project, I think there are times where people simply build in places they shouldn't build.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you see their site flooded and you go, well, why did you build there? Why was that? Why would you put a house or
in a ditch,
an apartment building that close to the beach? Or why would you? So I hope also it's not just, what do you do with the water, but how do you rethink, where you build?
Yeah.
So do you have any count as to how many living units you actually have in this entire
Yeah,
development?
so it's about 30 units per acre, like a typical garden city. So I have 1,342 units total.
So that's a huge project, a lot of people. Like a lot of the critics here, I applaud the thesis behind this and putting a serious problem and how does the building world respond to it on the table for everybody. One of the problems when you start out with a big idea is your project becomes, how does this project think, as opposed to how does this problem feel? And I'm just a little troubled by the environment you've created. I faulted some of the earlier projects as having too much going on. Well, in ways you don't have enough going on. Every house is the same, every mid-rise is the same, every courtyard is the same, the high-rise, it's all the same aesthetic. It's blank walls, dark colors, effectively acres of parking lots with buildings on top of them. It just doesn't feel like a pleasant place to be. And I applaud the thought behind it, but I just, as you move forward in your career, I encourage you to think about actually using what you're designing and how does it feel.
So that might be a problem with my intent. My original intent was to there was this bridge concept of safety above, water below, and when I envisioned the original aesthetic, I was playing around with just letting the place flood and dealing with sea level rise, and then it became about making it about resiliency in the face of flooding. So one of the original aesthetics was keeping, when you're on the street level, keeping views throughout the site and using the parking that happens below as a means of keeping all the valuable stuff out of the ground plane, but also allowing when a pedestrian is on the street level to view straight through and see almost an expansive landscape from the ground floor. But it's probably
all part with tall, flat SUV.
Sure. The ideal.
It's a very important question because this flooding that you're describing, how often do you see it happen?
So the 10-foot flooding.
That's going to inhabit these areas where you have these 6-story buildings. How often?
So the 10-foot flooding happens, it's going to happen, they say, once by 2100.
Once every, what, 100 years? Once every 50 years?
I think it's 100 years. Yeah.
So for 100 years, you're going to leave that streetscape looking like that until the flooding happens.
Yeah.
Is the issue. So, and I wonder, again, as you, if that's going to be your solution, I think that's okay. But you also have to sort of be the architect and be the urban planner that's trying to create, you said, a resilient sort of community, right, that thrives. You mentioned some component that I actually thought, because I actually enjoy your solution for the pontoon sort of raising amphibious component, because I see that in the subheading of the thesis, and I was sort of looking for that throughout. The solution for this one. And you mentioned these sort of pods that rotate.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, oh, as you were explaining, I'm going, oh, these are, workshops or whatever that they sort of fill the gap, like in case there isn't a flooding, and it becomes activated, it becomes populated, it becomes programmatically usable. And in the case of a flood, it shuts down and pivots to sort of allow the water to go through. That kind of solution, I think, will start to address what you're trying to sort of confront by saying, okay, you're going to be that developer that's going to build here, but I'm going to create some novel solutions in terms of how when water does invade. For example, in this case, in the single-family amphibious solution, when water does come in, this is how the architecture deals with it. Like when I look at the high-rise building and these other guys, and it's okay, if that's the way you choose to have your site planning, if that's what the developer wants, in terms of putting density here. But to your thesis of creating amphibious type of architecture and structure that solves the solution when the flood does come once every 100 years. I would love to see that populate your perspectives and actually have you elaborate and diagram those out and speak to us about that.
I agree.
The simplest solution is your diagram right over there. You just build on that high ground.
Just save them a lot of
Well, thanks everybody, and I just want to thank Bryan for all of his good work here. I met Bryan last year in 600 Studio, so it's been a pleasure to work with him 2 semesters now. Bryan is an intellectually curious person. He's unusually open to critique and exploration of alternatives. And I think at the end of the day, he's kind of a visionary. He's full of ideas. He's kind of an idea factory. And yet he has a facility with all kinds of drawing. He's a beautiful freehand drawer, and I'm actually surprised he didn't show other than the 2 tiny drawings. But he could probably fill this wall again with just the process. And as you can see, he has a great facility with computer drawings as well. And I just want to sort of reiterate that I think this was a huge undertaking. And that's also very Bryan, that he's ambitious and fearless in his very quiet way. And he sees the connection between things that a lot of folks do not. And so I think that ability to see how, or to begin to speculate on how your design career fits into this larger picture of this huge subject of climate change. And I almost don't, I'm all about going upstream as far as possible and sort of cutting the source off at the knees and trying to avoid having the problem, or to do as much as we can not to have the problem. But let's face it, we have the problem. So I think wherever you attack it, and I know this is such a sort of thorough investigation, or such an ambitious one, that there's so much thinking in here that we didn't get to talk about today. But as far as not contributing to the problem and being net zero, and dealing with surfaces that really are quite permeable, on down the line, as a set of ideas, I think it's going to carry you through your career. Probably, it's probably worth a few careers worth of material here. But just want to say what a joy it's been working with you, and to congratulate you on it.
Thank you.